Longevity and frequency. So this is something that we talk about, sort of our turnover on our system. So with this survey, much like in surveys in the recent past, 23% of all of our customers have been riding for less than 1 year. So you think about what that means. So that's almost 1 in 4 have been riding with us less than 1 year. So over the...
From what time period? Like the survey, was it from
when we asked the survey.
Did you ask them like after the new bus network?
No, we started this in September of 2014, and it went through around Thanksgiving of 2014.
Got it.
All of these results are pre-new bus networks.
Yes. So, and this has been historically pretty consistent for us. So if a quarter of your ridership is new every year, over the course of 4 or 5 years, you have almost a complete turnover. That's important when we talk about one of the things we use the survey for is how do we do marketing? How do we do communication? And we think about, for instance, when we implement the Q card, we think, well, gosh, we implemented the Q card 7 years ago, and we did a huge push, and we put lots of Q cards out there. When you think of it, the number of riders who are still with us when we did that blitz, while we're all familiar with it, a lot of our riders might not be. So it sort of really talks to how, for those really important messages, we need to consistently think about how do we get that information, how to ride, how to use the system, how to use it effectively is really key. So again, we have sort of the breakdown by mode for that. And also very interesting is how often folks ride the system. So 72% of all of our customers ride 5 or more times a week. So again, so people get very used to riding. They get very familiar, the vast majority of those. So on the local, for our local bus rider, that's a little bit higher than average. They're riding 5, 6, or 7 days a week. Rail is slightly lower, again, because of the medical center and some of the schools that are on there that are not 7-day-a-week type services. It's a little bit lower. And then Park and Ride is almost all 5-day-a-week service. We don't run anything on Saturday or Sunday. So work-related trips, our system remains very work trip heavy, so to speak. That is typical for most transit agencies. Usually well over 50% are work-related trips. That percentage increased on local bus slightly from 61 to 64% between our last survey. Metro Rail went down slightly from 74 to 67. Again, not surprising given that we opened the North Line extension. So before the North Line extension, it was a lot of work-related. They're going downtown, they're going to the medical center. When we opened up the North Line, we have a lot more educational, student-related trips, either going to North Line Commons and the HCC up there, or particularly connecting the two campuses, the main campus with the North Line campus. So that wasn't to be unexpected. The Park and Ride, again, virtually unchanged. Almost all of them are work-related trips. Average age to the system, very little change from our last survey. Now, what is notable here for Park and Ride in particular, what we have been seeing with each survey every 3 years, our Park and Ride riders they get 3 years older almost every survey, which really goes to speak that we have the same riders year over year over year, and we weren't getting a whole lot of new riders. This was the first time in over a decade, so of the last 3 or 4 surveys, that we actually saw that number decrease. Now, slightly, it'll be really interesting in 2017 if that number kicks up again, because what we would like to see is it not continuing to increase. We would like to see newer, younger folks choosing that service. So that was an interesting update. Race and ethnicity numbers for the system as a whole in the right-hand column. Nearly, not quite half, 45% are African American, followed by about 22% of Hispanic or Latino origin, and then followed by Anglo at about 19%. This is tied very closely to income levels when you look at where the routes run. And we have the breakdown for each one of the individual route types if you have any questions. But these are very similar to what we saw, again, in the 2011 survey. Household incomes, again, not surprising, particularly when you look at the local bus. The vast majority of our riders on the local bus have very low incomes. So when you look at, particularly if you take the top two levels, you think about under $32,000. That is very close to poverty classification for the U.S. government for a family of four. So when you add up those top two numbers, particularly for local bus, you're over 60%. Even for Metro Rail, you're at nearly 40%, have very low incomes. Park and Ride is sort of the polar opposite of that. We tend to have much higher incomes there. And all services, we're just under 50% for that.
Let me go back to the slide on page 8.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been stories in the paper recently that 40% of our ridership is Hispanic. And this says, 21% on the bus, 22% overall.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder how that squares, where the 40% is coming from, and if this is more accurate. In other words, I wonder where the 40% came from to begin with.
I'm not sure where the 40% is. I can tell you from having done this several times here and in other cities, it is a common theme throughout this country. We get an underreporting of Hispanics in surveys. There's a whole host of literature as to why, whether it's immigration status, fear of retaliation, a number of things. Language barrier, we do make this available in English and Spanish, but this is underreported on the Hispanic side. I will be honest with you there. This is self-reporting. We offer you a survey. You don't have to fill it out. We don't classify anybody. We don't write down, oh, this person declined it, and they're clearly Hispanic. We don't try and do that. You have to be willing to fill out the survey yourself.
Do you know why, Christoph? I mean, am I wrong about that? Hasn't the publicity recently?
Is this that article about transit coverage that you're thinking of?
No, I was thinking about the fact with respect to a Latino board member and that issue. I thought the Chronicle said 40% of the ridership was Hispanic. I could have gotten that wrong.
I believe that what they have reported is 40% of our service area's population. According to
that's what they
the
reported.
Census is Hispanic.
Yes, that's what they
And that
reported.
again points
Okay.
to we're underreporting. You would expect these numbers to somewhat mirror the population that's within our service area.
Right.
Not perfectly, because we don't touch every corner of our service area, but I believe that's what it is. I think the Hispanic population within Metro service area is approaching 40%.
Okay, that makes sense.
Madam Chair, I want to
Thank
remind
you.
Mr. Begley from the Chronicle did acknowledge it was 40% population, so, and he's in the back of the room, so.
Kurt, is the procedure
Okay.
in taking the survey that the survey taker fills the form out while they're with the individual?
We do, we offer the survey to every person who boards. Now, on the train, we can't give a whole lot of assistance because it's very busy and people are riding very short distances. We offer help if people have questions. What we have done now for the last 2 surveys, which has increased our response rate, is we have self-addressed stamped each, done guaranteed postage return or whatever, and said, if you don't have time to fill it out, please complete it and mail it back to us. And that has increased our response rate
Yeah, I would-
by like 5%.
I would think that would enhance the return
Yeah.
somewhat.
You think about if you're a park and ride user, you're going to be on that bus for 40 to 60 minutes. You have more than enough time to fill out, a 5 or 6 minute survey. If you're a local bus rider and your average distance that you're only going to be on that bus 5-10 minutes, or a rail rider that you might only be riding from Smithlands to TMC, you don't have time to fill that out. So we do make accommodation for folks.
I may have missed it, but you asked the question if a person has a disability, and also I wonder if you have some kind of assistance that may be provided to people who need assistance completing the survey?
We have not provided specific assistance. As I mentioned, we have anybody who has questions about it, we offer that. If they have, we say that they can call customer service if they have particular questions after they've taken it home. Very few people avail themselves of that. Most people either do it then or they start filling it out if they're going to do it at all. But we have not offered specific assistance. That's not to say that we couldn't in the future. That might have an effect on the cost and the number of people that you might have to have available on a particular vehicle to do so. Because it is important, we have to offer a survey to every person who boards to make sure that we get valid numbers. And if they refuse, we actually have to take that survey out of commission so that we know how many we distributed, how many were declined. But we have not offered specific assistance in the past.
And you do ask the question if they have a disability, a mobility impairment, if they use a wheelchair, if they have an ambulatory disability or difficulty walking?
That has not been a question on our past surveys, no.
Seems to me that the data would be important for us as we plan for the future and try to determine what kinds of future needs we're going to have for MetroLift and other services we offer.
We can look at those. We can look at those adjustments on the next survey that we'll be talking about in a few minutes.
Well, that's absolutely right. That is an oversight, so correct it.
Yeah, and it would clearly help us in planning for future bus purchases. For example, if we saw there was an increased need for wheelchair space on a bus, we could order those buses to be so designed.
Certainly. There were a couple of new questions that we did ask with this survey, so there's no comparison to the past. And one of them, there was a lot of interest in how do people access the internet? Do they have access to the internet? And if so, how do they access the internet? Obviously, we've been pushing out a lot more of our information to the internet via Facebook, via Twitter, and different things. So we wanted to get those senses. And what we had suspected was sort of the lower your income, the less access that you would have to the internet. That's sort of the hypothesis that we went in here to. And we expected to see, particularly on our local bus ridership, much less access to the internet. And the results were actually pretty surprising that even on the local bus, 90% of our customers had some access to the internet. You can see it broken down here. We asked them about homework on their phone or library. And what seems clear is more and more, even if you have low income, you tend to have a phone. You tend to have a data plan. You might not have high-speed internet access at home, but you have it and you use it on your phone, which was very interesting. So again, even 90% on local bus, which we expected to be the lowest, and it was, but not as low as we thought it might be. Metro Rail was 96, Park and Ride again was 99, so those were interesting for staff. We also asked a couple of questions about bicycle usage, since we have equipped all of our fixed routes with bicycle racks. And not long before we did this survey, we used to not allow bicycles on our trains during peak hours because we didn't have all two-car trains and we didn't have capacity. And we had lifted that, so we thought it was a good time to start asking about people's bicycle usage. It has been growing. It is still relatively low, so we asked people, was a bicycle part of their metro commute? So you can see still the largest percentage people didn't answer the question, and we're assuming most of those folks didn't answer because they don't use it. So it is low, it is growing. It is interesting that the highest numbers tend to be the most frequent. So if you do use a bike, you tend to use it 5, 6, and 7 days a week for that. So it will be interesting to see how this changes over time. And then we do see that those high numbers in the once in a while. So the rise of the occasional, I want to go down to Herman Park, for instance. I'm going to hop on the train, I'm going to bring my bike and then ride around the park, for instance.
The one thing that's worth noting here is if you count up the at least once a week, that's over 10%, which is a meaningful percentage. I mean, if you, going by past origin destination surveys, the percentage of our riders who use a car as part of their trip is 25%. So if bikes are at 10%, that means they are really a significant piece of the overall transit picture. I think more than most people would guess.
So that's sort of the high level of our last one, our last survey. And I just wanted to talk about briefly about our next proposed one in 2017 in fiscal year. As I mentioned, we're required by FTA to do this every 3 years. Next year will be the third year. We also have a requirement as part of our contract with the feds for the full funding grant agreement for building the new rail lines. We have to do a pre and post study, and part of that is an origin destination survey of routes. So we'll be doing those two things together to save money in 2017. So the good news is that 60% of the cost will actually be reimbursable. I think it's 59%, but 60% is roughly reimbursable by the FTA as part of our contract with them. So we will be, again, it will be interesting. We'll be able to get our first glimpse of sort of new bus network demographics. And with the all three train lines running as well. As I mentioned, we only had the North Line running with the last survey. So we anticipate roughly about $500,000 that this next one will cost will be our piece, and we should be able to get, as I said, 60% of that reimbursed. So the net should be about $200,000 to the budget when all is said and done.
Kurt, you'll recall from 2 years ago that my concern, I reckon this is very important that we do this. It bothered me, the cost, because it's about $37.50 for every recipient that we got. And I do urge you to look for the most economical way that we can do this and still get meaningful responses.
We will be doing that. We have already reached out to HGAC, who we are proposing to take the lead like they did 10 years ago on that. And we'll be meeting with them to go over the survey instrument, talking to them about like Board Member Frieden's suggestion about adding a question to that. It will be for all of the transit operators in the region. So Harris County Transit participates, Fort Bend County participates, the Woodlands participates in this. Even the trolley down in Galveston, they surveyed the last time as well. So
do those other agencies get this data as well since they participate? Do we share this data with them?
HGAC shares it with them.
Okay, I'm just curious because it sounds like we share the cost solely with HGAC and
HGAC has in the past, they have funded those other agencies' shares to my knowledge. Again, we make up the vast bulk of the cost for this. HGAC, if my recollection is right, they also ask some additional questions for their modeling because they do this for the whole 8-county region that we're not necessarily interested in. So they do pay the cost for the other agencies, is my recollection.
I do wonder why it costs so much. Because, for example, if you were doing a political poll, you might pay maximum something like $50,000 to interview 900 people. And while this is a totally different kind of thing, and it's only 900 people that you interview, I guess 50 times 15 would be, what would that be? But anyway, pardon? Yeah, so maybe it would be comparable. But you would think that the crunching of the data would not be hard.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we got about, it was on the first slide, I think it was about 26,000 surveys or so that we completed. We get many more back, but they have to complete so many questions of it to be valid.
Right.
Yes.
There are certain questions, we set it up, the first 10 questions they have to complete or it's not a valid survey.
Right.
And then we go on and ask roughly another 10 questions about bicycles and other things that we'd like to get information of. And that is information that we need to calibrate our travel demand model. So when we do major capital projects, like the rail lines, when we're planning a new transit center or park and ride, or we are looking at redoing the bus network, and we want to model what the ridership is. This is the information that we need. So once it starts getting 3 or 4 years old, it starts to affect your ability to really forecast. So we do get a lot of surveys that we have to process. They have to go through and check all those 10 answers to make sure, when you ask the question, where did you come from and where you're going to, and you need a geographic address. It's a tough thing to be able to, 710 Louisiana, you need that information, or a cross street. And some people don't spell so good. They're filling this out on the bus. It's legibility challenges.
Yes, it makes sense.
It's not multiple
yes.
choice.
Yeah.
There are
Right.
some blanks on there where you have to write in your origin, write in your destination, and the person processing those surveys has to convert that handwritten answer into an
Yeah.
actual database address. And that is
Right.
much harder than your typical multiple choice survey.
Right.
And the surveying costs are also high because you have to have people on the buses handing out the surveys. And while they're on that bus route, for part of the route, they may be handing out surveys at a pretty quick clip. But then the bus hits the Freeway Express segment, and for the next 20 minutes, they're on the bus. There's no people added. So it's not nearly as staff efficient on the handing out as, say, a phone survey is, where that surveying person will be constantly talking to somebody.
Right,
And those issues
right.
are basically unavoidable with a survey like this.
Well, I'm sure it's a standard cost in the industry. It just popped out as high to me.
Yeah, we're always amazed, I'm always amazed at how much it costs. I try and frame this that the federal government sort of requires this to make sure that you're eligible for funding. So I try to look at this, we get about $65 to $70 million a year from the federal government in operating assistance. So you look at what you get sort of over 3 years, you get roughly, $210 million for an agency of our size. They ask you to invest $500,000 to get that, so you have information that we not only use, but that we report to the feds. It's not such a bad trade-off in those regards, and it makes you eligible for a full funding grant agreement where we got $900 million. You have to make sure that you're in compliance when you have to do Title VI analysis. We use information from here about what our riders look like as a basis for that. So I understand that it's expensive, but we do use the data for a number of things that help us, and in some cases do allow us to get other monies and to be eligible for other grants.
Yes, I'm not suggesting the survey itself is unnecessary or unhelpful. I just raised what I think is probably turning out to be an ignorant point about the cost of it. So it's not analogous to the surveys I'm familiar with, so.
I'm just actually curious, based on your experience, you've done these surveys now probably a couple decades, let's just be conservative, and I'm just curious, right, so if with technology improvements, have you seen the cost trend down? I would imagine that technology would make it easier.
Every time we do this, we sit down with our consultants and we talk about, is this the year that we can go digital? So that I don't like having to print 80,000 paper surveys. I don't like to have somebody then read, they don't get 80,000 surveys,
Yeah,
but read 35,000 surveys and interpret them. I would much rather, can we hand somebody a tablet and say, please fill that out? The transit industry is doing much more of what we call intercept surveys. So when you have a survey about a particular site, that you have people at a particular transit center, tell us, how is this transit center functioning? Where are you going? What do you think about crime at this location? Or what would you like to see us build at this particular location? Where they engage people on site for 5, 10 minutes. They tend to do that survey by survey. It works very well in the transit industry, at least has gone that direction, as have other ones. For this survey, when you think about it, we have to offer a survey to every person who boards so that there's no inherent bias. I offered it to you, but I did not offer it to you. Why? That could have some bias in the survey. We have to offer it to everybody. I'm not sure on a bus route that has 40 people that I want one surveyor or two surveyor to have 40 iPads. Would you like to fill out a survey? Oh, yes, I would love to fill out a survey and take that iPad, and then they walk off the vehicle with it. That's the challenge that we have at this point in time. And one of the reasons why we wanted to ask on what is your access to the internet is, do we have the ability, certainly for smaller surveys, agencies have gone to handing out an index card to folks and say, I would really like it if you would log on with your phone, you give them a QR code, scan it in. If you would answer this 3 or 5 question survey, we'll enter you in, to win a prize of whatever. They are starting to do things like that with smaller surveys. It's still difficult because of the type of information we collect here. We haven't quite gotten to that sweet spot yet. Eventually, I think we'll be able to do something like that. Log in, scan this on your phone, and do it, because that will be a great day. That will cut down a lot of hassles and a lot of costs. I just don't think we're quite there yet.
And one thing I would say very strongly on this is this will be our first survey after the new bus network. I don't think this is a good time to change technology, because I think we want to make sure we have a very clear apples to apples comparison there of the before and the after.
But it does, when it does go digital, you have the ability to have it in multiple languages, which has a big benefit. I mean, right now, we pick English and Spanish for this. I'd love to have it in, the three different, Mandarin, and all of those things. There are some real possibilities going forward, but we're not quite there yet.
Are we good on moving this forward?
Yeah, I'm okay with the thing. Let me turn that on. What is our true ridership change? Obviously boardings are up, but transfers are also up. Mm-hmm. And Chief, when do you anticipate that's going to be?
Well, I've asked Mr. Larson them to really drill down on that so we can get the data and come back to the board with, so they're working on that now.
But the best data we will have is this survey, which will take some time to complete.
Well, but just knowing how much fare, came on at each boarding point, which is available now, that would give you somewhat of a profile.
I will say, I just saw some initial numbers today, and where it's got us asking a couple different questions. We cannot know how everybody uses the system and how they transfer. If they have a Q card, we have the ability to know how many times did they tap on the system, and we can compute a transfer rate for Q card users. Now that's not everybody in the system, and we've been working with Julie Fernandez in finance. She's run some initial numbers. We have some additional questions because we implemented the new bus network. We expected the ridership trends to really change. Then in January, the board said we want to eliminate the transfer penalty of time, of direction. So we would expect the transfer rate to tick up again there.
Well, yeah,
so we're trying to break all those
decision to do that, which also we knew would reduce revenue, but
right.
I still think that was something that was in the best interest of the ridership.
I am hopeful in the next month we will be able to come back and provide you a briefing.
I'm going to go back again, and Julie can correct me. 76% of our customers ride the system off the Q card, so I think we're going to get some data from that.
Yeah.
The longer-term survey will give us more when we do the 2017, but I think there's some snapshot things we can do now to at least get a sense of things, and that's what we're going to work on.
Okay. Next item.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, that brings us to briefing item number 10, which is the proposed August service change, and Mr. Jim Archer will be doing the presentation.
We come to that point in time in the year. We have 3 service changes each year, according to our labor agreement. We have one in January, one at the end of school, one at the start of school. As we have shared with this committee over the past few months, we have made huge changes to the system in the last 12 months. So part of our goal in August is to begin to calm down and to reduce the number of changes that our customers are having to address. The first item that we're showing on slide 3, the board has already approved last month. However, because of our particular policy for a major service change, we have to announce any new service as part of a public hearing and as part of a service change. So we're including the Manchester here just to let you know that when we have our public hearing on Tuesday, June the 28th, we will have to encourage public comment on this route. We are certainly hopeful that some of the people that are looking forward to riding it will come down and express their appreciation for our having added this service back in. Slide 4 is a proposal to add a new service that does not exist right now, and that is midday service on the Southwest Freeway corridor. Right now, we have midday service for all of our park and ride corridors, either through existing park and ride or in the case of the East Freeway through the 137 North Shore, with the exception of the Southwest Freeway. As you heard several months ago, a group has come forward of riders on the 151 who have asked us to consider something in the middle of the day that would get them from downtown out to the Hillcroft Transit Center and to provide some connectivity. In addition, we've had some requests from Transport Workers Union Local 260 to try to make an effort to reduce the number of trippers, which are bus operators that come in the morning, may not have any work, then come back in the afternoon. What we've been trying to do is come up with a creative solution to solve as many of these issues as possible. So this particular proposal would address all of those. It would provide midday service in the Southwest Freeway corridor where it doesn't exist. It would provide midday service for the 151 riders, which does not currently exist. It would reduce the number of trippers and increase the number of straight runs for our bus operators, which then also reduces the number of operators we have to have. So this combination provides something that we believe would be very beneficial in the long run.
Jim, does this run on the freeway or on the frontage road?
No, during the middle of the day, we do not have the HOV open on the Southwest Freeway, so it would be running on the main lanes and then a portion in the frontage road.
Have we reached any kind of agreement with MHMRA as to, I know we had made a proposal to them that we could have a bus stop fairly close to their facility if they would provide a shuttle service. And have they ever come back to us with what they might be?
Mr. Rumsfeld, I don't think they've come back to us with any further discussion. Now, we could reach out to them, but I don't think we've had any follow-up requests from them at all.
I know they do have a problem with heavily medicated patients making that walk, particularly in summer heat, but I feel like that the proposal we made to them, in fact, Harris County was even willing to give them some money to operate the little shuttle that would run on the sidewalk. I just haven't heard the one.
Let us reach back with them, but I don't think we've had any follow-up contact with them at all.
None that I'm aware of.
I'd like to know.
We will do that.
But I think this is a great idea to basically allow that midday service, and I think it's a great solution for the Hillcroft customers.
Slide 5. At this point in time, we have been trying to work through, as you're aware, in January we made changes to a number of routes to try to address running time issues. Likewise, last week with the June service change, we made adjustments to many routes. We have one route that has been brought to our attention, the 96 Veterans Memorial on weekday, that still has some running time issues in the afternoon. So we're proposing to put in some additional time to be able to address that situation. Additionally, we wanted to alert the board to a map change in connection with the 41 Kirby Polk. We had proposed this particular route to make a movement once the construction was done on Shepherd. It turns out that our bus is not able to make that particular movement. However, we can duplicate the movement we're making in the westbound direction going eastbound. We have bus stops already there. This is simply a case of making that change. It's already on detour right now, but again, because this is a change in the way The routing was presented to the board. We wanted to bring this back, make sure people are aware of it.
So this is now in service?
This is in
going
service
past the
now.
lighthouse for
We
the
would
line.
be asking the board's approval to make it as a permanent.
Okay.
Slide 7 provides the estimated operating cost impact. Again, Manchester-Lawndale was approved last month. That's already set. The route realignment is no cost. So basically what we're looking at here is the new service on the 269 and then addressing the running time issues. Now, the 96 Veterans Memorial is a green or coverage route. By definition, it has very low ridership. So that's why the cost per boarding is significantly higher on that particular one. And again, it's a situation of trying to address the running time, trying to ensure improved reliability. The good thing here is that we are not looking at adding any new bus stops. We would need to add a slat to 2 bays at the Hillcroft Transit Center for the 269. I am assured that that cost is extremely low and is less than $1,000, so we did not bring that forward. But yes, there is a small cost associated with it. Again, we did the presentation today. We have a public hearing on June the 28th. We would come back to the board for formal approval of the August service change next month, have operators sign up August 1st to 12th, and we would implement this on Sunday, August the 21st. Happy to answer any questions. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that brings us to briefing item number 11. This is a very important briefing item. It has been since 1998 that we have evaluated what the design specifications are at our bus stops. And as we focus on our customer experience at these stops, we think it's a good time to come back to the board, get guidance as to what should be in our specifications. The importance of these specifications is these are the documents that we give to our designers, outside designers, as guidance as to how to design a particular stop. What goes into these documents is basically what the end result will be. I think there is a discrepancy with what's in these specifications and where the board would like to go as far as the customer experience at our stops. So Mr. Mike Williams, who's in our engineering department, has put together a briefing on potential options and changes to consider. And with that, we'll let Mr. Williams start.
And I'll note as a heads up to everyone, this, I'm going to need to leave at 4:30, which I think is when the meeting was originally scheduled to end, but we have a very long agenda, so I know there will be items left at that point.
And Mr. Spieler had a lot to do with this presentation, had a lot of good ideas that we're presenting. I hope we illustrate his ideas and give them justice. Again, my name is Mike Williams. The current bus designs that we have for the bus for pads as well as sheltered sites is simply this. We put a 5x8 concrete pad out there that is required for ADA, as well as tie-in transitions on both sides to existing sidewalks if they exist. And then with the shelter, we have the 5x8 pad as well as the shelter pad itself. The shelter is included in that when we install a shelter site, as well as a trash receptacle and all the connections, the transitions, etc. ADA requires us to install a 5x8 pad. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that when we deploy our ramps from our buses, they're typically 3 feet or so, and it provides a 5-foot turnaround. We really can't get around not installing a 5x8 pad. This is really dependent upon right-of-way, and you'll soon find out that right-of-way is an issue for us on many of our stops. The other issue that we typically run into is access to these pads. In many cases, the city sidewalks are very old, and they've collapsed, and the slopes are often bad. And what our objective is to do is to provide a safe access to the closest point we can, and that's our objective. So we will replace a little bit of the sidewalk as long as the budget allows us to do so. And again, we're doing this to get patrons to our stops. The other thing I should point out is the fact that if a sidewalk does not exist, the street can be considered a safe access point or an ADA access point, path. So that again, if we don't have a sidewalk, people use the street to get to a site. That's perfectly acceptable. As far as the different buses that we are going to design for, it's typical. The articulated bus, 60-foot bus, and the 40-foot bus that we have. And these are all typical. The 60-foot we actually have on some of the red routes, and I've listed them here on this slide, as well as an orange route, if you would, the 108 and the 151. And the other routes typically have a 40-foot bus on it. And that's really going to be the focus of our changes in the designs, as you will see. This is a typical current bus stop design, and I might add that this is under perfect site conditions. Rarely are we allowed this opportunity where we can go out and install a 5x8 pad and put in 5-foot transitions on both sides and get it to work this well, okay? So as we move forward, just realize that we had to show something, and we're showing this just to illustrate the ideas going forward.
No, and I want to underline something here. The issue in many bus stops is that the design of the street does not allow sufficient right-of-way between the curb and the private property for that 8-foot stop. That is simply unacceptable. That whenever the county or any of the member cities designs a street, they need to be designing for that 8 feet. That's federal law. That's not optional. So that what you're talking about is situations in which we are retrofitting in places in which the original design of the street really didn't accommodate that. Any street that is rebuilt ought to be accommodating that 8-foot dimension.
Exactly. And I'm going to step through what we propose on the non-sheltered sites here. The first would be, the first step, or the first proposal was just to add a bench. And you can see the existing changes to that. We'd have to add the additional concrete, and that's what you see in the orange is the additional concrete being added to the existing site. And then next, as we step through it, now this is to accommodate not only the bench, but a 40-foot bus as well. So you can see how much additional concrete is needed to do that. Now, what needs to be pointed out is that the front door is the only door that's really required to have the 5x8 pad. The back door, we don't have to pour that 5x8 pad to meet ADA compliance.
Because there's no ramp at the back door.
That's exactly right. And then you can see here that this is the 60-foot bus, what is required to provide enough pavement to accommodate a 60-foot bus.
And what I want to note here is the orange is shaded for additional pavement, but a lot of that is an area in which sidewalk would have existed anyway. It's not like that would have all been grass in a regular installation. In a regular installation, most of that additional concrete would actually have been sidewalk.
Yeah, in fact, you can see that right here. So you can see where the existing sidewalk is, and as we move through, we're just eliminating the sidewalk.
So the actual amount of added concrete in most conditions is actually very small. And I would say, I think being able to get off the back door of a bus, regardless of weather conditions, is a huge benefit to riders, and it is also a huge benefit to schedule reliability. Because if the people boarding the bus have to wait for everyone else to get off first, as they don't want to step into the mud, you are going to be stopped longer at that stop. And on a rainy day, that will repeat itself at stop after stop.
These are the costs that we've determined to add the bench, as well as the bench in the 40-foot bus and the 60-foot bus to our non-sheltered site. And then if we were to go with, I'm sorry, let's go step back here for just a second. I apologize, guys. This is a new, if we build this new non-sheltered site, These are the costs associated with that. And these are the costs associated with modifying an existing site and adding the concrete and bench.
And when we're talking about a new site here, this is a case where it's an existing built street and we are coming in and modifying the street. It's not the cost where a street is being rebuilt anyway.
This is our sheltered site, typical installation. You can see the 5x8 pad as well as the shelter and the trash receptacle. The pad for the shelter would be obviously underneath the shelter, and then of course we allow the concrete to expand out to the curb face to allow access in and around the shelter. And we're going to get the most bang for the buck on this by extending out the necessary dimension to get the 40-foot bus. You can see what little pavement is involved here. And in fact, out of any of the concepts, this one is very doable. It's, you know, $1,000 extra to provide this additional concrete and provide the access to the back door then. And then this is the 60-foot bus here.
And I would say that as a general statement, I think we should make a practice of, if we are, number one, I think we should, I totally agree with the recommendation on saying every stop should be designed for the back door on a 40-foot bus, and on the red routes that might go to Arctics, you design everything for a 60. I would further say that if we're pouring concrete, we should go ahead and pour a pad that can handle a shelter, even if we are not immediately installing a shelter, because if the boardings, et cetera, justify it, that allows us to add in a shelter later at relatively low cost without coming back out to build it. So I think if the site permits it, if the room is there, we should just be doing that as a default, that we have the pad in place for a shelter.
It would be very little money to do it. And again, these are the costs for a new bus stop sheltered site, and you can see how accommodating the 40-foot bus is very little money. And this is if we have to go back and retrofit a stop. Now, I'd mentioned that the perfect conditions. So, you know, this is typically what we deal with when we go out and install a sheltered site or a non-sheltered site. The reality is we're dealing with elevation issues. We'd have to, cut into the embankment, install retaining walls, and then you end up with sidewalk issues with slopes on sidewalks, and so you build more retaining wall. Inlets typically require us, and we're often running into inlets, so it typically requires us to move the stop a little further down the street. Driveways, they're, you can imagine the issue with the driveway. It's at the street level predominantly. So if your back door is dropping people off on a driveway, that's not necessarily a good thing.
No, it's better than dropping them off on grass.
Well, that's true. I agree with that. And of course, we live in a beautiful city with beautiful trees, and we're constantly dealing with trees. And there's a solution to this. We could just reduce the amount of concrete and have just a landing pad tied to the sidewalk to provide for these trees. But again, every site has to be looked at individually. There's no answer for all of it. There isn't there's very, very few sites out there that repeat the same conditions. And of course, the limited right-of-way is the issue that Mr. Spieler talked about. And of course, we're constantly dealing with utilities, either utility poles, boxes, or whatever, storm sewer manholes. But utilities do end up being a constant issue for us. And so now we're just looking for additional feedback. I think Mr. Spieler's already provided a wonderful idea.
Okay. Well, from what I'm hearing, I guess what I heard is the design specification should accommodate front and back door loading and unloading. So that means an extension of the pad. Every pad for every stop that we put out there should handle a shelter if the site permits.
If the right-of-way permits.
If the right-of-way permits. I think the one other question is benches. In some discussions, there was some discussions that every stop should have a bench. Is that something that we want to proceed with, or is that something that we want to leave optional per ridership? I think the next presentation is our bus shelter guidelines, which was a board request from last month. If you want to wait on that decision until Rocky does his
that's
presentation.
kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg.
Yes, sir.
If you've got a bench, you might very well get more ridership.
No, my tendency is because benches are relatively cheap and benches do not add maintenance cost, that saying we will have a bench if there is room for a bench, I think is a very good practice.
Okay.
Because that is a huge upgrade for a rider. And that is true even if a stop is low ridership. You are still making somebody's life considerably better by adding that bench.
Okay.
So my tendency is to say, let's do benches.
Yeah, if you're on a coverage route, you don't want to stand there for 30 minutes. You
Absolutely.
just
I'm
like to
just
sit down.
totally in agreement with that. And while we're on this subject, how do you study whether a bus stop, and this is relevant to some other comments folks have made, but obviously having a bus stop could increase ridership. How do you figure out where, if you put one there, ridership would increase, as opposed to making a determination of where to put one based on ridership?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think generally speaking, we know what the right spacing for stops along a route is. And that if we have cases where we have a big space, we are probably missing ridership if there's some destinations around there. Once stops are at that kind of spacing, once you have a stop every 3 blocks or so, you're not going to gain ridership from adding more stops. And at some point you actually lose it because added stops make the trip slower. So I would say generally across our system, the provision, the location of the stops themselves is not what's driving ridership. Generally, we have stops all the way along a route. There aren't people who are on a route and unable to reach a stop.
I meant
amenities,
shelters.
however,
Oh,
yeah,
see,
amenities
okay.
I think is a very big. And I mean, to me, and this will be the comment I make before I leave on the next one. I think it is important to have a criterion for prioritizing shelters because we have a limited shelter budget. In other words, I think it is very important that we have the criteria that we do that say, if we're going to put 100 shelters out there, where would be
Yes.
the best places to put them?
Right.
That said, I believe the ideal transit network has a shelter at every stop. And that I feel our policy should be to say, the ideal world does put a shelter everywhere. And we will pursue that to the degree that our financial means will allow us to. But I don't think there is such a thing as a stop that has so few boardings that a shelter is inappropriate. A shelter is never a bad thing. So I think generally we should be aiming to get as many shelters as we can. And that's not, and frankly, I'm in favor of more shelters even if they don't add a single rider. Because if they make our existing riders' trips more pleasant, that is reason enough to add a shelter.
And we have a presentation that talks to those guidelines as the next presentation. We'll have every opportunity to change that.
Right. No, and that's my comment on the guidelines, is I think the guidelines are good, but I know that in the past things have arisen, for example, where, you know, some local landowner had complaints about having a shelter, or something was being rebuilt and there was an existing shelter and there was a question, do we need a shelter there? I don't think we should be removing shelters. Like it seems to me it doesn't make sense to apply those guidelines and say this stop has too few boardings to deserve a shelter. I think every stop deserves a shelter.
And again, we're going to continue to push the envelope a bit because we're going to look at different designs. I know Rocky's looking at that as well to see if we can maximize putting more shelters out.
Well, from my standpoint, I completely agree with what Christoph just said. I think every bus stop ideally should have a shelter, and I would love to look at ways we could involve the private sector in that. Just as management districts take on the responsibility of putting shelters in their area, I've even wondered if we could approach nonprofits in Houston about the idea of funding bus shelters, because the shelter itself is not that expensive comparatively to some other amenities that folks could use out there. And the concrete, further to your point and Jim's point, we should always pour the concrete so that we have it, would make that much easier for private sector people to come in and just install shelters. And your idea, which you've consistently reiterated, that anytime there's development anywhere, people ought to be charged with putting in bus stops and shelters.
Well, wasn't
you
it
know.
last year that Leadership Houston donated three, I think it was
Yeah.
3 shelters to
They did, and they did a great job with the artwork too, and I think they also gave us some guidance in going forward to work with the private sector, see some opportunities. So I think we need to look at that.
No, and I want to underline that because one of the things about standards is we talk about standards in terms of our own work. But part of the reason for us adopting good standards is a majority of the construction that impacts our bus stops is non-metro construction. It's either a public entity rebuilding a roadway or it is a private developer rebuilding a block face as part of their development. These standards here should be standards for all of our member jurisdictions so that whenever there is any construction that touches a block face, the shelter, the bus stop is upgraded as part of that. And I do think something that would be very interesting to look at on a policy level is for, say, the city of Houston to adopt an ordinance that says if there is new commercial construction that is on a bus route and there is a bus stop there, that developer pays the cost of providing a bus shelter. I think that's entirely appropriate. Just like we expect that developer to provide the cost of bringing that sidewalk up to compliance. It is a very small cost if you look at it as the cost of a new development, and it has the potential to upgrade our network in a very significant way, and it is an amenity for those neighboring landowners, for those residents of that new apartment complex, for example.
Agreed.
We will
I
update
have, one question, if I may. It was said that the street may function in the absence of a sidewalk accessibility to a bus stop for wheelchair users. And my question is, does the design account for a ramp going from the bus stop to the street then? Or how's the person in the street supposed to be levitated to the level of the bus stop?
Absolutely. If we ran into that condition, obviously, as we work through the ADA compliance, and if there isn't any other connection, we would absolutely install a ramp to provide access to that bus pad from the street, as well as probably additional sidewalk to make the connection as safe as we can. Just enough sidewalk to make that connection. But again, it's a site-by-site basis, and we would just have to see how it works at that particular site. And again, the intent is to make sure that we design it as best we can for ADA compliance.
Mr. Chairman, I know we have.
I think it's important that we don't make further investments that are subject to compliance reviews. And I mean, it's just wrong to build new sites, new bus sites, or stops that are not fully accessible. And then obviously we have an issue of compliance with extant stops.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. We consider that to be last case scenario or worst case scenario if we ever do it at all. The process is we have a accessibility specialist that's involved in the design process to make sure that we are ADA accessible. And then out in the field, we also have another check when the work is performed out in the field to make sure it's accessible also. So we do have some checks and balances in the design and construction process to make sure we're ADA accessible and TDLR accessible. And using the street is just it's just a clause. It's not something that we as a staff try to design to.
Yeah, I think the whole point of suggesting using the street is the fact that it's the city's responsibility, it's the county's responsibility to provide sidewalks. When we come in and install a bus pad, Metro is not required to install sidewalks. We're going to do whatever we need to do to make it safe and access for our patrons. That's primary for us. And so it's all based upon budgets, and if we come to that position, obviously, and we've got to spend above the budget, we would come back and discuss this with the board and let you know where we stand with the design and what needs to be done to accommodate it.
Well, I with due respect, I am concerned about the liability that whoever you're referring to is the entity that causes someone to use the street as a means of mobility. If that person is injured, then whoever suggested that or made that a requirement is probably going to be liable, and I don't want it to be Metro.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Spreen, what I fully expect we will do is that once we get a clear understanding of what the design standards are, we work with our partners at the city, the county, the multi-cities, and TxDOT, that we change the new dynamic going forward, that we limit the number of people that have to use a street network to safely travel where they need to go. And so I think we will continue to open up that dialogue and hopefully change the dynamics going forward to make sure that there's ease of access to transit. I think we heard very clearly from the board and the board retreat, the ease of access to transit, the safe access to transit, the improvement of the amenities for folks using transit are critical, and I think we'll continue to work very diligently with our partners to make that happen.
Well, let me just add, if we are suggesting to people that they use the street as an alternative to a sidewalk that's not there, and I understand that may be the only alternative, then at least we should put a sign up for traffic that says, please be advised, people with mobility impairments in wheelchairs, with walkers, and with difficulty walking may be using this street for access to the bus.
I agree. We'll take up that topic, and I guess I need to get an education on that as well. So we'll get an education and go forward. Mr. Chairman, with your approval, we're going to delay the remaining items because I think some of them are significantly important to go forward. And what I'm going to ask is that we at least can do the Uptown BRT briefing at the full board.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'd like to delay these till the next meeting, if that's okay with you.
Let me request if we could just very briefly talk about that air conditioner issue at the property on San
Then we'll tee up
Jacinto.
the item number 13 then. Is that okay?
That's become a really bad problem for the
Okay.
sheriff's office.
All right, we'll do that.
Mr. Moreros.
All right, so this briefing is intended to brief the board on the situation at our 810 North San Jacinto facility, commonly referred to as Buffalo Bayou, and operations calls them the midday lot. Operational date, August of 1994, total of 12.4 acres, almost 58,000 square feet, and capacity for 216 stops. As I mentioned, we use it as a midday lot to store buses between morning and evening peak hours, and it served as a headquarters for Metro Police Department for many years, and currently is occupied under a lease agreement by our partners from Harris County Sheriff's Office. A few details on the current lease with Harris County. Started in April of 2014. They're not leasing the entire facility, only 44,283 square feet, plus 145 parkings. Duration of the lease is 3 years. The monthly rent, $77,143. What's included in that lease is the maintenance, utilities, and rent. And the lease is currently active, and Harris County has indicated to Metro their desire to extend the lease. So why are we here? Basically, you're talking about some issues that the building has experienced in the past few weeks that have had consequences on the operations in terms of specifically heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. We had several failures of critical pieces of equipment that they're assets that are close to, if not exceeding, their life expectancy. In addition to that, we have aging infrastructure associated with the emergency power systems, hot water and heat, as well as the building controls. What does all those issues have resulted in hot spots in the building, making it uncomfortable for the tenants, inconsistent cooling, impacting the tenants' ability to bring additional personnel on site, and impairing their ability to conduct their business as intended. In addition, not very energy efficient. So staff has, first I'd like to report that the issues have been addressed. So right now the building is fully operational once again. This doesn't address all the longer issues, and especially life cycle issues and the need to upgrade some of the systems. Staff looked at various options, starting with the first one, which we discussed in a meeting with Harris County, being to conduct a retro commissioning of the building, which basically is upgrading the building controls to allow for more efficient operations of the existing systems and to bring the necessary manpower to improve those controls and tune them in such a way that energy efficiency is improved and customer comfort is addressed. Our estimate to do this would be $250,000, and if the funding is made available, we could do this work before the end of this fiscal year. Option number 2, or 1B in this case, because it's associated with the first one as well, is the plan to basically retrofit all assets that are either at or beyond end of life. That would include the replacing of all chill water systems, air handlers, the hot water boiler, replace that with strips to make it more efficient and remove that altogether from the building. Performing a full test and balance of all HVAC systems, as well as the purchasing and installation of a new emergency generator capable of running the entire facility to support the tenants' needs for their operation. Our estimate to do this would be $3.1 million. We've included a project in our CIP for FY17. Assuming that this funding is made available, we estimate a completion date of the third quarter in FY17. Lastly, what we're calling option number 2 has to do with the ongoing conversations with the county in terms of a Metro seeding the facility and getting in-kind replacement of the property and nearby properties. This is an ongoing process that's been going on with the county for various years. The Harris County Flood District is planning to redirect some of the areas in the White Oak Bayou to mitigate flooding, and some of that would require elimination of portions of this building. So those conversations are ongoing with the Harris County and the Sheriff's Department as well. And what this option would present is that Metro staff and would be entering into negotiations with the county to have the county assume the responsibility for the upgrade of all these systems in lieu of the lease payments and until the final land acquisition is completed. This obviously would require board approval, and those terms for that type of agreement will be brought back to the board for review and discussion.
Okay, and let me, Dr. Freed, let me make a comment on this. I'd gotten an update from the county engineer this morning. They really would like to go ahead and have flood control purchase that property in this fiscal year. And they have clarified on the issue of appraisal. I think Metro is getting the survey for the part that's going to be taken. I don't think you've ordered an appraisal yet.
No, we haven't.
They will go ahead and order an appraisal as soon as you have the survey, and then Metro would pay for the review appraisal.
Okay, yes, sir.
Okay, so we have not ordered the appraisal
We
yet.
have not ordered the appraisal. We do have the surveys.
Okay, well, if you can get that survey to Shannon Watson, who is the right-of-way manager for Harris County, she will go ahead and order an appraisal from an MAI firm. And I think they use some of the same firms that Metro does. And then Metro could get, the review appraisal, which would share the cost on that stuff. And since they want to go ahead and flood control wants to spend their money out of this fiscal year, they've gone back and they had a look at this building late last week, and they believe they could do the repairs, not counting the generator that's out, but they feel like they could do what they need to do to the HVAC and boiler system for $1,250,000, which would be the cheapest alternative for Metro rather than spending, $3 million. And so what they would like to pursue, and what I'd recommend that, Chief, that you go ahead and enter into negotiations with the county engineer and with flood control, since they want to go ahead and buy it right away. This would clearly be the least expensive option for Metro, and it would also fix the things that they need to fix this summer when it's so hot for the sheriff's office.
Yes, sir. We will aggressively go after that schedule. I will say that any appraisal process has to go to FTA. We cannot control that timeline, but we will make every effort to make sure it gets done this fiscal year.
Okay. Well, if they could go ahead and order up an appraisal, though, if they see what, the survey of what would be taken.
Yes, sir.
And,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, we'll begin the conversation, negotiation going forward, and we'll keep the board posted on where we're at.
and Shannon Watson would be the person to contact. She
Okay.
is the county's right-of-way manager. All right. Well, thank you all. Well, this, I think it's great to put the rest of the stuff off until next month, and then the other item for the briefing at the board. So we are adjourned.
Dr. Frieden, thank you, sir. We're going to delay the other items for the next committee meeting, and we're going to do the Uptown BRT at the full board.
They get, they get, here's